What's going on, guys? Ben Brewster, and I wanted to do a little bit of a different video today, just because so many people have been asking for this video. I posted an update last week on social media that I was going to be getting my third hip surgery, and I just got a hip resurfacing surgery about 6 days ago. And so people seem to want an update. They wanted to kind of understand where I was at in my, you know, physical health, career, why I haven't played professionally in the past 6 years, all that sort of thing. So I've kind of held off on making this video for a while because at each step of kind of this injury and recovery process, I thought I was just at the cusp of making it back and, was going to wait and do that video, like kind of seeing the struggles and then seeing me on the other side. But I thought it'd be interesting just, you know, telling the story now at this point versus waiting for that time whenever it may come. Um, and just hopefully this video helps people that might be specifically pitchers, but really any athlete that's dealing with hip impingement or FAI. Hopefully give a little bit of my side of the story and some context and some kind of practical tips and things that I've learned along the way. So I'd like to relay my own experience with FAI, which is essentially hip impingement, femoral acetabular impingement syndrome. Basically, the symptoms, and this is really common in hockey. It's really common in any sort of rotational sport. Um, it can be kind of a genetic thing as well, but essentially you get an impingement in your hip, usually during hip flexion and internal rotation. So you can imagine in hockey when you're constantly bent over and moving laterally, your hip is in that flexion internal rotation position. It's pretty common in tennis as well. So you can imagine being planting, stopping yourself and then changing direction. Again, you're in that hip flexion internal rotation position. And then with pitching, again, in my case, it's been my back hip, kind of been the bane of my existence for the past 4 or 5 years. When you need to be able to sit and hinge and kind of drive off that back hip, what are you in? You're in that hip flexion internal rotation position. So hopefully, athletes of all sports, but specifically pitchers, hopefully this video can be helpful and just kind of satisfy some curiosity that people might have about my story specifically. So I have in total now had five not hip surgeries, but 5 surgeries total, 3 hip surgeries since the start of 2017. So I'm almost on one surgery a year at this point. But it's really been 2 things that have been the reason I haven't been able to make it back into professional baseball during this time frame. One is the elbow, and then 2 is the hip. The elbow, I had a partial UCL tear, got a primary repair in 2017, had a few complications with that, ultimately got an arthroscopy follow-up, removed a bone spur, removed a plica, and the arm is fine right now. The elbow is great. So it's really been the hip. Now, my story with the hip started, I was coming back from the 2017 UCL surgery. And so at that point, I was feeling amazing. Like the hip was healthy. I hadn't had any hip issues remotely over the course of my high school or college career. I'm a guy with a ton of internal rotation naturally. And so, I was doing a lot of roll-ins and just really aggressively sitting into my back hip. And I was able to create a ton of separation, and I was throwing hard. So I'm coming back from that surgery. I'm 6 months out of the elbow surgery, and I'm sitting 96, 97, 96, 98 in bullpens. I'm like, this is great. In a few more months, I'll throw live hitters. I'll be ready to sign. I'll do a video on like kind of the whole rehab process. And somewhere along the lines, about 6 months after I was kind of throwing, again, I was dealing with some kind of elbow complications at that point too. But I started to feel like there was a block somewhere I couldn't figure out exactly where because I wasn't having necessarily pain in my hip at that point, but I felt like I couldn't separate the way I normally was able to. Like I couldn't create that dissociation between my upper half and my lower half. I couldn't stay in my back leg on something like a roll-in where I'm trying to keep my hips forward and my upper half closed. And so initially I was like, well, this is kind of weird. I don't know what's going on. And I just kind of kept throwing through it, trying to figure it out. And I started having back pain on the same side, and then ultimately knee pain on the same side. And what I later figured out was it was really my body trying to compensate around this hip block. And I was trying to separate more from my spine, and I was trying to, dump into my knee more. I was trying to get into these positions that I had used to be able to feel, but I was actually not creating that rotation, that true rotation from the hip socket. I was trying to compensate from the joints above and below it. And so I basically chased around all through 2018, chronic back pain on the same side every time I try to get back into throwing, chronic knee pain, patellofemoral pain syndrome. Again, just because I was trying to compensate through this, I didn't fully realize it was coming from the hip at that point. I work through those. I get the knee calmed down. I get the back calmed down. I realize, okay, I'm not going to compensate with my back when I throw. I'm not going to compensate with my knee when I throw. I start to try to drive the range from the hip, and truly like isolate it down to this is how I need to throw. I still felt like there was a block, but that's when the pain came, and this was about 2019. And so I started having like kind of sharp anterior medial hip pinch every time I would drop into my back hip and try to, create that power and actually rotate from my hips. And so for a while, I tried to navigate around it. I would find myself kind of extending and jumping out of my backside, not really like sitting into my lower half, just kind of extending early. And I could feel like my arm was taking over the throw. I could feel all this bang, this wear, this tear was on my arm. I was fatiguing way earlier than I normally would, like 15, 20 pitches at a high intensity. My arm was, gassed. It would feel like it would normally feel after 40 or 50 or 60 at a high intensity. The velo would take off early, so even if I could just brute force like 93 or 94 on flat ground, like all arm, it would take off really fast. 15, 20 pitches, like I'm gassed. Versus, with the hip working properly, it's like nothing under 96, and I felt like I could do it all day because the power was all coming from the lower half, and the arm was just along for the ride, along for the ride. So I started to realize, like, okay, the hip is actually the core issue here. At least I know what's going on. At least I know why all this stuff is happening. But it still didn't really help as far as, okay, I'm having sharp hip pain, like I need to find a way to through this. So just to backtrack, like as far as what the pain is like, it really is more of just like a true hip pinch when the knee comes up to kind of above 90 degrees and when you're sitting in the backside. So as soon as I would go through my leg lift and drop into my backside, and anything above like 50, 60, 70% effort, when I would really aggressively do that, that's when I would get the pain. So I've still been able to like demonstrate throws and stuff on videos since that point, and it's been healthy enough through various stages in the process to like throw at 75, 80% without issues. It's really like the aggressive positions that you need to be able to get into. You need to be able to shift your weight and throw yourself down the mound and throw yourself into the back hip and be able to trust that that back hip is going to support you in a stable way. And the second you have this pain, this pinch sensation, your body's going to start to navigate around that pain however it possibly can. And so that's what I was dealing with as far as the pain. It obviously started more gradually. It started as this block feeling, and I think what ultimately was going on is I had this impingement with different ways to look at it. For me, I had both a cam and a pincer, but essentially you have the acetabulum and you have the head of the femur, right? So the head of the femur, the acetabulum, that's your hip socket. And as you go into flexion, internal rotation, external rotation, like your hip is ideally gliding nice and smoothly. You have plenty of room in the socket, and this ball is staying centered. It's actually very similar to the shoulder joint in the sense that, you have a ton of degrees of freedom, a ton of range of motion in the joint, but you want to be able to keep that joint centered as you're moving. Now, what can happen, and you also have a labrum that lines the socket, so the acetabulum is kind of the socket. You have a labrum, which is like that lining, and then you also have a lining to the femur head, which is your cartilage, your hyaline cartilage. And so those two linings, if you start to get anything out of whack, those two linings will start to grind on each other. And so what can happen is this head of the femur, it's really the neck of the femur, can develop a little like bump or bone spur on it essentially. And so when you go into this flexion internal rotation position, that bump or that bone spur, like I'll sometimes explain it, it's not exact here, but I'll explain it where I like put my knuckle up like this. And it's like that knuckle is now grinding when you go into those positions on the labrum, on the socket, but it's also wearing down the actual cartilage. You can get wear down to the cartilage of the femur head as well. And so that's one side of how the impingement can happen. The other side is, again, you have this socket, but you can have a little bit of bony growth from the socket itself where it kind of hooks down, and so the head will get caught on that as well. So you can have bony growth on the neck of the femur. You can also have a pincer bony growth on the acetabulum side of it. And so it can happen one or the other or both. In my case, I had a little bit of both, but it was primarily the cam side of it. And so for me, I did try a number of things before ultimately doing surgery. But the reason that it didn't initially hurt me, as I understand it, is that it takes a while for this wear and tear to actually result in a tear to the labrum in terms of, for damage to occur in the actual cartilage lining of the head of the femur. It just takes a while. So you might have this block initially and a performance decrease and just feeling like something's a little bit off, a loss of range of motion, but it might not necessarily turn into actual pain until you've worn it down enough to where you actually get that tear in the labrum, or you actually create some sort of real trauma. So I think that's likely what was going on, is it just took some time for me to get to that point where I reached way above the pain threshold and I actually knew that something was like definitely wrong. So from that point, like, what did I try? Because I didn't just immediately jump to surgery. Like, I'm not sitting here like trying to get a bunch of surgeries. The first thing that I tried, which I would certainly recommend if you get a medical opinion and they're like, well, this is kind of borderline. We can operate or we can do something conservative. From the conservative side, one product that I would certainly recommend, it's called the FAI fix, but essentially it's all the conservative non-surgical approaches, interventions that you can do that a good therapist would already be doing a lot of these things with you anyway, but it's something that you can kind of self-guide your way through. And it's designed by a couple PTs, but that was, I would say, helpful. It didn't fix mine in my case, but I learned a lot through that, and that was certainly helpful. But essentially, it's how can we optimize the mechanics of the hip joint? How can we optimize all the soft tissues that influence these positions? Um, in a certain number of cases, like surgery isn't necessarily needed because you can buy some space and steal some space by just opening up the adductors, opening up and optimizing glute function, the hip rotators, the hip flexors, opening up hip extension. A lot of times there are going to be tensional imbalances in how that hip is functioning, and if you address the soft tissue, you address activation of all the muscles, and you can get that hip a little bit more centered in the socket, or open up the posterior capsule, just get that hip functioning better from a soft tissue standpoint, then that will alleviate a lot of the symptoms. And so I would certainly suggest trying that first. It's called the FAI fix. No affiliation with them besides I tried it. I can't say it fixed mine, but I would still say it's worth trying. And there's a lot of valuable information through there. One thing in particular that did seem to help a little bit with the symptoms, didn't fix me, but helped a little bit more than everything else, was really addressing the adductor complex. So what I learned and what I began to understand was the adductors are frequently very, very tight, at least in pitchers. I'm sure in other sports as well, but pitchers, especially on that back leg, because you're putting so much eccentric stress through that back leg. As you stride down the mound, you're really getting into that abducted position, almost that lateral lunge position where that back hip, that back adductor is really taking on a lot of stress. So over time, you can start to get muscular adhesions. You can start to get flexibility issues in that back hip. And so opening up the adductor was a big piece of that for me. Soft tissue work, end range activations were helpful, and I would start to feel like, okay, maybe I could buy myself an extra 5 degrees of range of motion in there. It would start to feel a little bit cleaner temporarily after doing some of the adductor tissue work. Capsule mobs were helpful as well, but again, I bought myself maybe like a 5% improvement. It just wasn't enough at the end of the day. So I was still throwing through all this period. I was still keeping my arm in shape. I was throwing, upper 80s, 90 mile an hour on flat ground out of just upper half drills. So keeping everything in shape, just trying to get everything else healthy to where when I got that fixed, put it all together, get back to upper 90s. But ultimately, I had opted for surgery in June of 2020. I actually knew I was going to need surgery in January or February, but couldn't get surgery due to COVID in March or April or May. Ended up getting that in June of 2020. So again, what did they find? They removed a cam lesion, so they shaved down that little bone spur on the neck of the femur. They found a pincer as well, so they shaved down some of that extra bone on the socket part, that little hook that comes down that was impinging it as well. They repaired the labrum where it was torn, and then they stitched everything up as far as the capsule. They have to cut through the capsule to actually get into the joint. And then they repair the capsule as well. That surgery didn't go as well as I would have hoped. Normally, you would be walking fairly normal at like 2-3 months from a hip arthroscopy. For me, I wasn't walking without a limp until month 7, so way more delayed than it probably should have been. So at that point, I was like, okay, something's probably not healing fully right. I was starting to ask some of those questions. And for me, what turned out was one of the main complications is called heterotopic ossification, or HO, and it can happen after surgery. It doesn't have to just be hip surgeries. It can be shoulder surgeries. But essentially, you get some calcification or like some bone growth as far as how your body heals from that surgery. So I went back for post-op imaging, and they see on the X-ray like there's a bunch of like calcification and basically bone chips in my hip capsule from where they had initially done the incision and done the surgery. So now I was 7 months out from that surgery. I was starting to walk normal. I was starting to throw. I was starting to load it again, but I was essentially still worse off at that point than I was pre-surgery, because now I was dealing with this kind of bony growth, calcification in my capsule. I couldn't really like fully like shift my weight into my back leg into my left side without feeling like, my TFL and the lateral hip just really had trouble opening up and didn't feel pliable anymore at that point. Um, by month 10, 11, I still wasn't like fully squatting to depth. I could get just above parallel. I could load that up, but I would still get a pinch if I went below parallel. And then again, throwing, like I could throw 92, 93 on flat ground, like pretty much all arm. But I couldn't use my lower half. I couldn't rotate. I couldn't use my back leg how I needed to. And so again, it's one of those things like, why not just go throw and just all arm and be 93? And there's no point at that. Like, I don't see the purpose of that. My arm wouldn't hold up through a full season throwing without using my back leg, and it's just putting like a shadow of what I should be on the field. Like, there's no point. So I needed to get healthy, um, and there's some examples of this in through MLB history. One example is Tim Lincecum, who I've never talked to him personally. I don't know all the intricate details of his story, but he has had the hip labrum issues. He did have hip surgery with the second surgeon, who I'll get to in a second. My second surgery, the same guy. And so again, you can see the drastic deterioration of performance and of velocity the second you start to have any sort of hip impingement issues. I think Lincecum's were actually in his front hip, if I'm not mistaken. But the point being, the second you lose that ability to rotate cleanly, and the back hip in specific, like, that is just where all of the power is being generated from, or a large percentage of the power. If you have any sort of spinal issue or like hip issue, I guess you could say shoulder issue as well, that just represents a major leak in the chain. And anybody that I've worked with who's had some sort of hip impingement issue, we're usually talking like a 4 mile an hour or 5 mile an hour drop in velocity. I've seen guys that throw 94 drop to like 86. Like, it's a steep drop off in velocity when you lose the ability to actually rotate cleanly, because now you chopped a rotation off the equation. You're pretty much forced to now use your upper half and be a very linear thrower, and so that's why it's such a detrimental issue that it's really hard to work through. It's really hard to work around. Again, you lose all that stability on the back leg, and I tried as well to like compensate how, like, all sorts of different ways to throw around it. Could I just like kind of jump off my back leg but still get my hips through, like Shane McClanahan? Could I externally rotate my back leg so that I'm not using as much IR? Could I, maybe not have as much hip flexion when I throw? Could I elevate the heel, use like heel inserts in my shoe so that I'm a little bit more knee forward, a little bit less hip flexion dominant? I tried a bunch of different things, and at the end of the day, again, have concluded like I need my hip to throw properly. And that's, it's just even more telling like how important the back hip is in the throw and how important clean rotation of that joint is. So I was about a year out from the first hip surgery. I was probably 5% worse than I was pre-surgery, or unchanged. And so I was like, I need to figure out what's going on. So I went to one of the top guys in the world, Dr. Philippon, out in Vail with the Stedman Clinic. He's known for being one of the kind of grandfathers of this procedure. He does a lot of revision procedures as well. And so I went out to him. He said, you have a ton of HO in your capsule. We could probably shave down the cam lesion a little bit more. That's another common reason for failed initial hip procedures, is that essentially the surgeons are doing this fine balancing act of, they don't want to shave down too much bone to where now you can get a femoral neck fracture because you've taken too much bone away from that femur, and so now it becomes brittle. But if you don't shave down enough, if you take that kind of like bone spur and you only shave down a little bit of it, and so it's not fully concave, now essentially it just still does what it originally did, which is impinge the joint. So he was like, we probably take a little bit more away, open up a little bit more space. We can re-repair the labrum, and we can take out all those specific like bone fragments from your hip capsule. So April 2021, I had the second surgery out in Vail. I was initially flying out just to get a surgical opinion. He was like, I'll do the surgery 2 days later. Like, we got to get you back. And so he did it 2 days later. It was a 7-hour surgery, just because of everything he had to kind of undo from the first surgery and then again redo the surgery. So he removed all the bone fragments. I've got a picture from that surgery where one of them was like the size of, I think it was like a nickel, like pretty large like piece of bone just like lodged in my hip capsule, and then a bunch of like a dozen other little fragments in there that he had to methodically pull out. shaved down the cam, re-repaired the labrum, and then he added something which I think he calls it a capsulolabral spacer, which essentially it's like another little buffer in there to prevent adhesions from forming in the joint. And a lot of times he was explaining like it can be like the cam lesion that just wasn't shaved out, but it can also be how you rehab and how you heal from the surgery has a huge role in whether you know get back to full range of motion or not. So a lot of times it's the scar tissue that forms in that first 2, 4, 6 weeks after surgery, that if it forms inside the joint, that can be what's ultimately pinching in the joint. That can be what is restricting the range of motion. And so like at by any means we need to prevent adhesions from forming in the joint in this second revision surgery. And so they had a ton of other protocols like in the rehab process to try to mitigate that as much as possible. Whereas the first surgery, the first surgeon, it was kind of like do the surgery, discharge you, see you, you never hear from, don't really hear from them again. You know, it was different here at the Stedman Clinic because they specifically assign a surgical coordinator that they're following up with you. You know, you're there for a week after surgery doing PT every day. You're on the bike twice a day. You're following up with a surgical coordinator every 2 to 4 weeks. They're asking how you're doing. You have a specific protocol and routine on your phone, on an app. You know exactly what to do each day. You're in the pool. You're doing bike workouts twice a day. So it's managed much differently from an actual rehabilitation standpoint. There were a ton of different medications to try to prevent scar tissue buildup. I was sleeping with what's called a CPM machine, which you have to sleep on your back, and it's a machine that basically moves your hip into flexion and extension very slowly. And so you can, over time, maybe like the first week, you're just going up and down a little bit, but over time it's bringing your knee all the way to your chest, all the way back slowly throughout the night, and you wear that for the first 4 to 6 weeks. And the idea of that is basically continue to just grease the groove, continue to just drive range of motion and prevent stagnation and potentially build up of that scar tissue inside the joint itself and adhesions. So that was a huge differentiator. Supplementation, like doing the pool workouts, biking twice a day, even from the day after surgery, I was on the bike, through the range of motion I could do, passively letting it kind of move through that range of motion. Hip circles, like all this stuff was specifically geared at preventing adhesions from forming. So it was just a completely different experience from the first surgery. I was walking normally by week 12, which was roughly on track. I was like, this is great. We're gonna kill this. We're gonna kill the rehab. Month 7 to 8, so around January, I'm throwing with some intensity by that point, and I do my first like 95% flat ground. I'm sitting 93. I'm like, this is okay. It doesn't quite feel right, but like this is a starting point. Like if I can just get 5 to 10% better now over the next 6, 7 months, like I'll be where I need to be. I just need to continue to get a little bit better every month from this point on. And at that point, I still felt like I was throwing all arm. I still felt like I had to jump out on my back leg a little bit. Again, I was still, 3 or 4 miles an hour off, my best flat ground numbers or where, my best mountain numbers would have been. But I kind of got in this rut where like I could really make sure my hip was calmed down. I could throw, it would be all arm. It would be like almost right. And then the next day, if I tried to throw again, it would start to get inflamed. It'd be inflamed, it'd be irritated. And then the closer I would get to my kind of true patterns, like really sitting into my back hip, like that would still pinch. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just keep working through it, trying to optimize everything I can. You went back to the surgeon. He was like, your capsule just isn't fully healed yet. Let's try a PRP shot. So I shut down for a few months, did a PRP shot, continued with all the rehab, continued with all the soft tissue work, isometrics, end range activations, like everything to basically get my hip as strong and stable as possible in every single plane of motion, optimize the tissue quality, every single side of the joint. I was doing all that stuff, shockwave, dry needling, red light therapy, all that stuff, microcurrent. I was ultimately able by the year mark after the PRP shot, I was able to get to full hip flexion in a squatting position. So with my knees angled outwards and some external rotation, I could get full depth there in a squat, which was great. I felt like my day-to-day stuff, my training, like I could get that was mostly normal. So that was certainly better than pre-surgery from the second surgery. But again, it was still in that specific position of hip flexion and IR. So a deep lunge or a deep Bulgarian split squat, or if I was trying to do a lateral move and change direction like in tennis, or the idea of like going and skating like a hockey player and like aggressively pushing off, like those specific positions would still give me a pinch, or even like bringing my knee to my chest. I couldn't even get close to my chest where I could easily touch my chest laying on my back with my good hip. Or a seated internal rotation test, just 20, 25 degrees of IR versus, 45, 50 degrees of IR on my good hip. So there was just still some red flags, like it wasn't fully normal. And getting back into throwing, I was optimistic. I was like, okay, my hip capsule, it's a little more healed now. Let's see how it goes. And really the same thing. It would feel okay at 80%, 90%. As soon as I got to 100%, and I was really trying to test the hip and sit into it, that pinch would still be there. I'd be hopping out of my back leg, compensating every which way. I'd be whatever, 92, 93, all arm, fatiguing, same exact thing, same exact pinch. So, okay, let's just keep trying, keep getting strong. I mean, I'm belt squatting 600 pounds at this point. I'm vertical jumping 35 inches. I'm hip thrusting 600 pounds for reps. I'm doing everything I possibly can. I get another PRP shot. This one is called a phyto-rich PRP. This Dr. Anthony Gallia in Toronto. It's an extra strong, special anti-inflammatory PRP shot. I do that. I'm like, okay, maybe it just needs a little bit more time to heal. Let's do that. Now a couple months out of that, continue throwing, ease back into it, same thing. So this was around the time when, we started training Luke Barr, Daniel Barr's younger brother, and I'm talking to him, and he's like, "Have you ever heard of hip resurfacing?" Because I'm pretty stuck. I'm like, okay, I'm 18 months out of my second hip surgery. I'm still exactly where I originally was. Like, what is the alternative from here? Like, maybe I just keep going, and at the 2-year mark, it's the 5-10% better than I need. Is there another alternative? And he's like, dude, I was going through the same thing. Mine was like probably way worse than yours was. I had no cartilage left in my hip. They were like, we can't even do the one you got because your hip is in such bad shape. He was down from like mid 90s to 86, 87, I believe. We'll get him on the podcast and talk to him about this at some point here. But he was like, yeah, I was in such bad shape. I'd be limping off the mound. It was ruining my life. Like I was going to probably get released. And so they actually recommended that he get a hip resurfacing. And I was like, what? I've never heard of that. And so essentially what it is they go in and they give you a like perfect brand new joint, and you basically have a metal on metal joint. So, I can link to some resources on exactly what it is and like better descriptions than I can give because I'm not a doctor. But essentially what they're doing is you have your socket, you have your acetabulum lined with the labrum, you have the head of your femur, which is again lined with a cartilage, you have the neck of your femur, and the issue is that you're getting some sort of grinding in there, right? Grinding on the labrum, there's friction in there, there's a tear in the labrum, or there's friction on the cartilage. There's some sort of issue with that contact. So what they do is they're basically taking a metal cap and putting it on your femur head, and they're putting a metal socket in your hip socket. And so now instead of it being labrum on cartilage, you basically have metal on metal. Okay, so anything that would be pinching in the joint itself is theoretically gone because it's just a metal on metal joint. And they try to maintain as much possible bone mass as possible, as they can. So instead of a hip replacement, or a hip replacement, they take a ton of bone. They take the head of your femur, they just like chop it off. They take a ton of bone. With the resurfacing, all they're doing is shaving down a little bit of the bone, shaping it, shaving it down just enough to put the cap on. So you still retain most of your original bone. So I'm gonna give you guys a trigger warning here because I'm gonna show you pictures now of what my hip looked like before, like in the surgery, opened up, what does my femur head look like, and what it looks like now. But essentially what they do is they cut you open like through your entire glute, like essentially like a 10 to 12 inch incision that I've got now. They open you up, they cut through the glute, they cut through the hip rotators, through the capsule, they open you up so they can get access to the head of your femur. They dislocate the femur head basically out of your body. So you're on the table, now your femur head is like out here. That gives them access to it. They shave everything down, they fit a metal cap on it after drilling a hole, adding some glue to this thing. They hammer it onto the head of your femur. Now your femur is basically a metal cap. And then same thing, they shave out your labrum, they shave down your hip socket, and they put a metal socket in there. They close you back up, they stitch you back up. And so that was 6 days ago for me. But anyway, Luke was the second MLB pitcher to get that and come back and pitch in the big leagues. Colby Lewis was the first. I don't know if you guys remember that name. That's 4 or 5 years ago now at this point. We have a former NBA player, Gerald Henderson, here in Charlotte, who Luke talked to, who's had it as well. Luke reiterated to me, like, look, it was really freaky when I first heard about this as an option, um, but there's nothing to be afraid of, was what he told me, because essentially 6 months after the surgery, he was throwing mid 90s in bullpens again, felt completely pain free, range of motion better than he'd ever been originally, like could pull his knee to his chest, full hip IR, all that stuff. So that was one of the things that kind of pushed me over the edge of like, okay, I need to look into this. I'd never heard about it before. At least now there's another option to be able to potentially throw pain free. And then I also stumbled across a really cool documentary with Andy Murray, who's at various points been the top tennis player in the world. And so this documentary specifically was made to follow him through a normal hip arthroscopy procedure. And they're doing this documentary, they're filming the whole process, and he just never quite is able to get back to where he needs to. And they're documenting it. He's like back in like some preliminary matches. He just like is not himself. He can't plant and push off. He's still getting pain. He's still limping. He's close-ish. He can do a lot of things. He has a lot of function, but he doesn't have the actual specific positions, the specific function that he needs to actually perform at the highest level. So if I were just going to go and like flick 90 miles an hour and like not really use my back leg, or I'm a high school kid, like it would be different. But it's specific to like what he was trying to do required full function, and so they're following him through this entire process, and they're like, crap, like the procedure really didn't work. And so this is when he's like announcing, hey, I'm probably going to retire. This is probably my last year. Um, you know, I wish I could keep going, but I just can't. And then he finds out about the resurfacing procedure. He gets the resurfacing. They follow this through the documentary as well. And then he comes back 6 months later after that resurfacing. He's back to competing, and that was in 2019. He's still competing today at, I believe he's 33 or 34 years old now. Still one of the better tennis players in the world. So I was like, okay, this is like, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. Certainly this has a higher probability of working than what I was already doing, which is just like another 6 months from here of resting, rehabbing, like maybe another PRP shot. Like there's only, once you've tried everything, it's like, what else are you supposed to do? So this is really like the final option at this point. And so we'll see how it goes from this point on. But I'm certainly very optimistic based on all the feedback, all the other athlete stories that I've heard. As far as kind of the history of this procedure, my understanding is that this has only been really tested for about 20 years, which is short in the sense of how long most procedures have been out there. You think of Tommy John, I believe that was in the 70s that was developed. And so it doesn't really start to become completely mainstream until 20, 30 years, 40 years after that procedure really started, once, all the little kinks have been worked out of the procedure and it starts to really become mainstream. And so with the resurfacing applied to professional athletes, my understanding is that that's really only been the past 5 years or so that they've really begun to do these on athletes and start to show some of those positive outcomes. So anyway, for me, on the head of the femur, that cartilage was significantly worn down in just a very precise spot and wear pattern. And again, that's really all I ever felt. I had good function after the second surgery in squatting in almost every position. I could almost do like full side splits, like almost every position except flexion and internal rotation. There was like that one spot on the clock where I would feel that pinch, feel that pain. Almost every other position was fine. So I was expecting there to be something there, some wear and tear, but not completely just obliterated. All the cartilage is gone, all the labrum is gone, nothing like that. And so again, that's what they found. So I guess let's go over to end this out, like recommendations for, you, if you're a pitcher, just an athlete in general, having hip pain, some recommendations, and like, if you're just curious, like what are my goals? So if you're having hip pain, I would say first is get a diagnosis from a PT, physio, or a doctor who has a lot of experience with athletes and with hip pain. I would try, if you have the option, try the non-surgical approach first. Obviously, see what the doctor says. If you're in a loop barred situation where the hip is just completely obliterated, you have zero cartilage, it's like, okay, you're probably going to need surgery if you want to keep playing at some point. Or in 10 years, you're going to need hip replacement anyway. Like, you're going to have to make a decision. That might be okay, we just need to do what the doctor suggests. But if you have that option and it's not at the point where it's completely debilitating, the non-surgical approach, I think the FAI fix is a really good, easy option for the average person to try and to implement. They do a great job with those videos and explaining like how to do tissue work in layman's terms, how to do different activation and strengthening work in layman's terms. So I think that's a great starting point, addressing all those different factors. Um, from there, you're going to have a couple different options if you do decide to go the surgical route. My biggest advice would be to find the surgeons slash facilities that are going to be world class. They're going to have the most experience in this procedure or in your sport. My experience, there's a big difference, and this isn't just for hip surgery. Like, this is working with athletes. A big difference between like whatever the local surgeon you have in your hometown and like the best guy in the world or the best guy or two in the country. There's a lot of times a big gap between those. Just like you can go to your physical therapist down the street, or you can find the best physical therapist in your entire city. Like, there's going to be a massive difference in terms of the outcomes there, potentially in terms of how they handle the rehab recommendations, the post-surgical medication guidelines, all that stuff. So for me, and having gone through this a bunch now, the two places that are probably worth going to, if you can make it work, the Stedman Clinic in Vail, just very professional, very clean experience, start to finish. And then the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. Again, they're also really known for pushing the envelope and developing a lot of these procedures and fine-tuning a lot of these procedures. I had my resurfacing with Dr. Edwin Sue. Dr. Kelly is in New York as well, and then Dr. Philippon is at the Stedman Clinic in Vail. So I would certainly say those are like the world-class, renowned places. If you're going to get a surgical opinion, it's probably worth the extra expense, travel, whatever you need to do to do it right if you're going to do it. And then the resurfacing, again, it's a new but promising procedure. Andy Murray was talking about it in his documentary, where he was basically like, tennis isn't just a game for me. Like, this is my life. Like, this is way more than a game, and that's really how I feel about it. So like, I'm willing to do what I need to do to try to get this right and to try to play and try to throw again. So yes, it is kind of a scary, like, alarming procedure, like what they have to do, all the damage they're essentially doing to your body to try to fix it. But for me, I think that risk is worth it, and that's the decision I made. So we'll see how the next 6, 8, 9 months go. This is kind of the end of the line as far as if this doesn't work. Like, there isn't any other option for fixing the hip that would enable elite performance. At that point, you need a hip replacement. You're not going to return to professional sports with a hip replacement. So we'll see how it goes. Completely at peace with the outcome, whatever it ends up being, but I'm going to do everything I can, let the cards fall where they fall. So it's going to be interesting over the next 5, 10, 15 years to see if the resurfacing procedure starts to get more popular, if they start to opt for it in certain scenarios. Kind of makes me think about with UCL, like, now it's not just Tommy John. It's, Tommy John, a full reconstruction, and you also have the primary repair option for partial tears, for less severe tears. So I wonder if this can start to gain a little more popularity as outcomes get better, as it becomes performed by more surgeons than just like a select few that do this procedure. So I'll keep you all posted. My goal is to get healthy, be able to throw hard. If I can fix the hip, I have no doubt I will be able to throw upper 90s again. If I can throw upper 90s again, I have no doubt I will be able to throw strikes at upper 90s with good off speed, good slider. If I can do that, I have no doubt I will get an opportunity somewhere. If I can do that, I'm just going to keep controlling what I can control and see where that road takes me. And really, that's all I can do. So I use this all as a learning experience. I thought it'd be good to share with you guys my experience, as opposed to just waiting until like the end, the finish line, which it may or may not come. But I'm going to share that experience, going forward. So yeah, hopefully you guys got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. Leave a comment down below. If you guys are struggling with hip pain yourself, feel free to shoot us an email, contact@athletics.com. Be able to help however I can. So thanks for watching, guys.